Welcome to another edition of Who's Number One. I'm Trey Wingo. Listen, are you feeling unloved, underappreciated? You have two choices. You can either call a 900 number or just look at the names that made our list on this show. Never has number 2, next in line, also ran Look So Good. These guys have been called modest, selfless, and unassuming. They're also known as ESPN Classic's 20 most underrated athletes of all time.
2020.
Looks good. Looks good. Do you believe it?
Tom Watson was every bit Nicklaus's equal for a long stretch of time.
2020.
Tom Watson was the consummate grinder, going resolutely about compiling a Hall of Fame resume that included 8 wins in majors, 5 of them British Opens. He amassed 39 tour victories and is only a PGA title shy of a career Grand Slam. 6 times he was Player of the Year, but always hovering over him, the shadow of a certain golden bear.
Tom Watson is definitely underrated, but you know, he was a victim of his time.
Jack Nicklaus is Babe Ruth. He's Wayne Gretzky. He's Michael Jordan. Tom Watson was next. That's still great, but next is always next, and next is never best.
He wasn't the most flamboyant guy, obviously, and he used to take a lot of heat for that.
Tom Watson was a worker. There's no question about that. He was famous for, even when he was playing well, he'd finish around and go out and practice.
Dull guys who are great, we always underrate them. They can win 8 major championships, they can win all this stuff, but it's all about excitement.
There was not a lot of pizzazz there. He's just a guy from the Midwest who went out and won golf tournaments. Definitely underrated.
Edgar Martinez, a fly ball to deep center field.
When you hit over 350 for a season in the major leagues and nobody knows who you are after you retire, that's a problem.
It will fly away. Edgar Martinez.
19.
Edgar Martinez was a DH, emphasis on the H, a hitting machine who, by dint of geography, never got his just dues. In 18 seasons, all in the Seattle Frontier Outpost, he rapped out more than 2,200 hits, averaged .312, and drove in more than 1,200 runs. When Ken Griffey Jr. was traded before the 2000 season, Martinez more than filled that power vacuum with a league-leading 145 RBI.
He hammers it to deep left field, way back and gone. A grand slam home run for Edgar Martinez.
Edgar Martinez has to be one of the most underrated baseball players in history, one of the most clutch hitters in the game, and defined designated hitter in the American League.
This guy could hit for average. Left-handers, right-handers. He was a doubles machine.
Yanks it to left center field, and Edgar's double has tied the game.
He played for a team like the Red Sox or the Yankees. He may have gotten a bit more pub, but playing 3,000 miles away from the media center of the country definitely hurt him.
There is something to Seattle being in the wilderness. It's not fair to people in Seattle, great athletes, but they kind of go up there and they disappear from the rest of us. If you were in New York, you'd be a legend.
18.
Juan Marichal was such an artiste on the mound that it was a pleasure to see him warm up. It was a pleasure to sit and watch.
18.
Juan Marichal had a chorus line delivery and a rubber right arm that produced 3,500 innings over 16 seasons. In a 7-year stretch in the 60s, the Dominican maestro was a 20-game winner 6 times for the Giants. In all, he won 243 games and compiled an ERA of 2.89 during his Hall of Fame career.
So many outings, so many innings, so many wins, so many things. I was like shocked. I'm like, wow. This is unreal, these numbers. Oh my God, he's great.
Juan Marichal was the greatest pitcher I ever faced in my life because he had 5 pitches he could throw for strikes at any given time.
If you were around when he pitched, he wasn't underrated. Now he is because no one remembers who he was, and that's the problem. We're all too I'm too old and everybody else is too young.
My son has a poster on his bedroom wall of Juan Marichal at the peak of his high kick windup. And he knows that it's a wonderful baseball poster, but he didn't know it was Marichal until I told him. I bet if it was Koufax, he'd have known.
17.
A good combination is scored and knocks Zimmerman back.
Evander Holyfield is reckoned to be one of the great fighters of his time. The problem is he kept going after his time was over.
An excellent round for Holyfield.
17.
Evander Holyfield was once thought to be too small to be a heavyweight. He responded by becoming the first to hold that title 4 times, in the process confirming his nickname, The Real Deal. Always fit, you could strike a match on his chiseled physique. He beat such marquee names as Mike Tyson, George Foreman, Larry Holmes, and Riddick Bowe, winning 36 of his first 39 fights before hanging on too long.
It's a shame that a guy who was such a great champion for so long will probably be known as the guy who got his ear bitten off by Mike Tyson.
His signature moments are that he beat Mike Tyson when we thought Mike Tyson was invincible. Turns out we were wrong about Tyson. So what does that tell us about Evander Holyfield?
Evander Holyfield was just a good boxer. That was not enough to sustain the heavyweight division.
I think he was a good fighter, but he had no charisma. You can't be like that if you're going to be in the public's eye.
As great as he was, he just kept fighting and fighting, and it was like, enough already. You were great.
16.
Maureen Conley was somebody that really played and fun to watch, and she was so consistent. Mo was a machine out there.
16.
She was called Little Mo, but her talent was taller than a redwood. With a winsome smile, Maureen Connolly fired baseline bullets and flitted about the court like a butterfly. In 1953, at the age of 18, she became the first woman to win the Grand Slam. But a year later, a horseback riding accident cut her career short.
I never saw her get nervous. Never saw her get the elbow, as we say in tennis. She just hit the ball harder and harder all the time, whether she was winning or losing, and she just got better and better as she went along.
Look at her shaking her fist. Absolutely, I will do it.
Maureen Conley was a huge influence upon me. She was the first woman to win a Grand Slam.
She hit the ball harder than the other girls and ran them around more than they ran her around, so she could dominate the play.
And a squeak of delight, and she's done it.
Maureen Connolly entered 9 Grand Slam tournaments in her life and won them all. Nobody will ever do that again.
15.
Lefty Grove was as dominant in 1929-31 as Sandy Koufax was from 1962 to 1966. I believe that Lefty Grove was the greatest pitcher of all time.
15.
He was hawk-like, lean and lanky, and if you managed to squeeze scores out of Lefty Grove, you'd accomplish something. He led the American League in ERA an unprecedented 9 times, and for the Philadelphia A's won 20 or more 7 straight years. In 1941, after 17 seasons, he retired with 300 wins and, in the lively ball era, an ERA of 3.06.
I never saw the man pitch, but 300 wins. You can make a case he's one of the top 5 pitchers in the history of baseball.
Take a look at how much better he is than the rest of the league and the next best pitcher in any given year, and you just have to marvel.
Could Lefty Grove have struck out the side against the 1996 Yankees? Who knows? Of course, he had a 102-mile-an-hour fastball, so I imagine he'd have done very well against any team.
14.
Harry Carson was a great player who had the misfortune of standing next to Lawrence Taylor. You know, sometimes in sports, it's like real estate. Location, location, location. Standing next to Lawrence Taylor is a very bad location.
From his middle linebacker position, Harry Carson did all the down and dirty work for the Giants for 13 star-spangled seasons, collapsing blockers, flushing quarterbacks, and smothering running backs. Despite his selfless work, he was rebuffed 12 times for the Pro Football Hall of Fame before finally being elected in 2006.
He was in the top 5 or 6 guys I've ever coached. He was a 9-time Pro Bowler. You don't have too many of those.
Have you ever seen these old Westerns where one guy holds down the fort until he gets help? That was Harry Carson.
The heart of that defense was Harry Carson. He never made a mistake, never found himself out of position. He'd end up with 12 or 13 tackles, and at the end of the year, he'd be playing in Hawaii.
He's the reason why Lawrence Taylor got all those sacks and all those tackles, because he was the one taking on all the blocks.
Lawrence made headlines on the football field, off the football field, during his career, after his career. Oh, by the way, Harry Carson was good, too.
Big, strong, physical middle linebacker, playing in the media capital of the world. Class act, but yet he seems to be on the outside looking in.
13.
One of the greatest Packers, if not one of the greatest football players of all time, was Don Hudson, and he's a guy that gets overlooked. He was as dominant for his time as anybody in the history of the National Football League.
13.
Don Hudson was to pass receiving what the Red Baron was to aviation. He ran precise patterns with a long loping stride and is credited with pioneering the art of getting open. Every 5th catch resulted in a touchdown for the Packers. When he retired in 1945 with 99 TD grabs, his closest pursuer was 62 behind that total.
You can make an educated argument that Don Hudson is the greatest offensive player, or I would say the greatest player ever to play.
To me, this guy set standards that I was trying to go after, and I could never surpass those standards. 99 touchdowns on 480 some odd catches. That is phenomenal.
Don had the speed. In fact, there's some records at Green Bay today still that Don Hudson holds.
He's underrated in the history of the NFL because he literally invented the idea of running a pass pattern the same way every time. When you see great wide receivers, the most basic thing they do started with Don Hudson.
12. Martin runs left side. He's at the 5, and he's into the end zone for the touchdown.
He is the dictionary definition of underappreciated. You look up underappreciated in the dictionary, there should be a picture of Curtis Martin.
12.
In each of his first 10 seasons, Curtis Martin amassed more than 1,000 yards rushing, a feat equaled only by Barry Sanders. First as a Patriot, then as a Jet, Martin has inched up on the list of total rushing yards, along the way becoming only the 4th running back ever with 14,000.
Strong runner. Don't get too much credit for being a strong runner. I hit him a couple of times, and, you know, he keep his legs moving, and you got to make sure you hold on, because he'll take you for a ride.
Bledsoe, short range to the flat with Curtis Martin. Breaking tackles for the first down.
He's not a guy that brings a lot of attention to himself, but the one thing you know with Curtis Martin, he was always consistently good.
Curtis Martin is the emblem of consistency.
Here's a guy who plays in New York, the media capital of the world, one of the best running backs of all time, and how could you possibly be in New York and be underrated? But Curtis Martin is.
He wasn't the guy that played to the media. He always played hurt. He always rushed for 1,000 yards. He had years where he had double-digit touchdowns, and that doesn't sell even in New York.
Guys like that never get the recognition they deserve, and he's not the only one. He's the poster child maybe for that group.
This guy was top shelf, no dust from the day he arrived in the NFL. I think way underrated.
11.
Jack Morris was one of the biggest big-game pitchers in the history of Major League Baseball, and nobody knows about it.
11.
Jack Morris was a snarling, hyper-competitive pitcher who thrived on center stage. He helped 3 teams win the World Series: the 1984 Tigers, the 1991 Twins, and the 1992 Blue Jays. In 18 big league seasons and nearly 4,000 innings, he won 254 games, compiling an ERA of 3.9. His 10-inning shutout of Atlanta in Game 7 of the 91 World Series sparkles still.
Jack Morris was a really good pitcher who pitched one of the great World Series games of all time. You pitched 10 scoreless innings in Game 7 of a World Series. I'm not sure how much more anyone can ask of you.
Game 7, on the line, 10 innings, gave them nothing. Jack Morris was the ace for 3 different World Series teams.
Jack Morris is underrated. He gets really dissed in the Hall of Fame balloting, but you could definitely make a case he belongs in Cooperstown.
Got him swinging, and he has his no-hitter.
Morris pitch, he used to get guys hooting at him from the other dugout. Why? Because he was competing so hard. He's one of those guys look in the dugout, and I mean, he's out there to beat you.
I think if the one word described him, he was a heck of a competitor.
Some guys are magical. Jack Morris was magical.
If I had the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory golden ticket, you know, the free admission, and I could give that to any baseball player into the Hall of Fame, I would give it to Jim Rice.
And there's a line shot, left field. Looking up, this ball is gone, a home run.
Jim Rice was both fearsome and feared in a 16-year career spent entirely with Boston. In half those seasons, he was an all-star and 3 times led the league in home runs. In 1978, he was the MVP, hitting .315, cracking 46 home runs, and driving in 139. His numbers are on the razor's edge, but he remains standing on the other side of the door into Cooperstown.
Jim Rice hit the most prodigious home runs you ever saw.
Here's a guy that is on the cusp. 298 batting average, not quite 300. 382 home runs, not quite 400.
He was a good athlete, could run. I think one year he hit 16 triples.
Rice is on his way to third, and Strawberry's throw not in time.
Jim Rice was the single most frightening hitter I think I ever saw as a fan.
And look at the Red Sox great Jimmy Rice at home plate.
Jim Rice, I think, is a very underrated player when you look at him history-wise.
How can you keep this guy out of the Hall of Fame? His numbers are there. You know why? Because a couple of guys got snubbed for an interview back in the day. He was a surly guy at times. He was moody. And those guys keep him out of the Hall of Fame, and it's totally unfair.
If you go by and look at that time compared to the players that are in the Hall of Fame, I should be in the Hall of Fame.
Jim Rice was playing at a time when 38 home runs and 109 RBIs was a huge year. The fact that they aren't anymore should not be held against him. Jim Rice is underappreciated.
Holmes dominating throughout the early going.
The Easton Assassin. He was a great fighter. He is underrated and underappreciated.
This may convince a lot of skeptics about Larry Holmes.
9.
In 1978, Larry Holmes pounded out a 15-round decision over Ken Norton for the heavyweight championship. He held the title until 1985, along the way winning his first 48 professional fights, one short of Rocky Marciano's heavyweight record for a career start. Holmes seemed always linked to Muhammad Ali as a sparring partner, conqueror, and unshakable shouter.
I'm glad Larry Holmes made the list. He was a good boxer, had enough power, had great ring smarts.
And he has been hurt. A right wobble snap.
Larry Holmes had the terrible misfortune of following Muhammad Ali. No one was going to follow Muhammad Ali. It's like whoever came on the Ed Sullivan Show after the Beatles. You don't remember. There's no reason to remember. It was the Beatles.
I'm sorry that I can't be a Muhammad Ali. I was born to be myself, Larry Holmes.
I don't think people realize that this guy was the longest reigning heavyweight champion ever.
You got to be around for more than a ham sandwich and a cup of tea. And he was around for more than a ham sandwich and a cup of tea.
Oh, that right hurt Ali.
Tough act to follow with Muhammad Ali, but he handled it pretty well. And he's a guy that really is somebody to be appreciated.
Talk about being underrated. Andre Dawson is right there at the top or the bottom of the list.
There's a drive. Way back. The Cubs win. The Cubs win. The Cubs win. Andre Dawson.
Andre Dawson amassed almost 2,800 hits and nearly 1,600 RBI and won 8 Gold Gloves. And in 1987 with the Cubs, he became the first player to be voted MVP on a last-place team when he led the National League with 49 homers and 137 RBI. Despite such credentials, Andre isn't in the Hall of Fame.
Going back. Oh, what a catch by Andre Dawson.
You know, one of the biggest mysteries known to mankind is why in the world is Andre Dawson not in the Baseball Hall of Fame? It's just incredible.
There are not a lot of guys that have the statistics that Andre Dawson has. When you're on a short list of guys for major accomplishments and you're not in the Hall of Fame, you're underrated.
Andre, right down the middle, straightaway center.
I think the thing that made him so good was that he knew the strike zone.
To sustain a career, to be able to go out there and perform every day, I never took that for granted.
Here's a guy that won a Most Valuable Player award for a last-place team. This guy was great.
7, 7, 7, 7.
There's a drive into left center field. That ball is going to be out of here. It's gone. It's 7:15. There's a new home run champion of all time, and it's Henry Aaron.
To me, it's amazing that he isn't on the tip of our tongues every time we talk about the greatest player in the history of baseball.
7, 7.
No major leaguer has hit as many home runs as he, 755. No one has driven in as many, 2,297. Hank Aaron made the All-Star team 21 straight times. For all his power, he still hit .305. For 13 consecutive years, he had at least 100 runs batted in. The eternal mystery is how such a titan could be underrated.
If anybody can hit 755 home runs and be underrated, it's Hank Aaron.
I would say he was like the lost sheep of the great ones. He never got that great of attention.
Aaron just came across as a passive, mechanical kind of player. Despite hitting more home runs than anybody in the history of baseball, really never got his due.
I didn't do things with a flair by no stretch of the imagination. I just didn't feel like I needed to run after the ball if it was 20 rows in the stands, you know, and kick it up all that fuss. What you saw me do on Monday is what you probably will come to the ballpark on Tuesday and Wednesday and see me do.
A swing and a drive back into center field. It's a home run. The Braves are the champions of the National League.
I admire Hank Aaron. We know the situation. We can understand what he's gone through. Do we appreciate what he stood for and what he has given to us? Oh, yes.
I think Hank Aaron's always going to be underrated to an extent because of the person he passed on the home run list.
Take a look at his other stats, the 3,000 hits, the RBIs. It all goes to the home runs, total bases. He did it all. He was the complete player, and nobody ever gives him credit.
6.
Gervin working against Magic Johnson. Smacks it in.
George Gervin, goes out and he scores 40 points, and you never see him sweat.
6.
And he
threw that off the top of the glass.
6.
George Gervin was Spider-Man in sneakers. He'd materialize out of thin air, float to the basket, and deposit in a finger roll. He was elected to the Hall of Fame and named one of the NBA's 50 best players. During his 14-year career in the ABA and the NBA, he averaged 26 points a game and won 4 scoring titles. Only Wilt Chamberlain and Michael Jordan had more.
I always liked George Gervin because he was cool. He was cool in the NBA before there was cool.
George Gervin, the Iceman, was one of those little viruses that got into the NBA from the ABA and added a lot of showmanship that later came to fruition in the 80s. Plus, George Gervin could score on anyone.
I had my best defensive game of my life against Ice Gervin. Effort-wise, I got through every pick. I had a hand in every face. Still got 51 points.
When you see Kobe Bryant score 81 points in a game, go back and look at Gervin's numbers. Probably underrated in the sense of when we think great scorers in NBA history, he doesn't immediately come to mind.
You talking about a guy who can make things happen, all-star? This guy is definitely underrated because you know what? He was so sweet going to the glass.
5, 5, 5.
Freezes Jordan, spins inside, reverses, hits it off the high glass. 2 dozen for Joe D. We're still in the first half.
Joe Dumars, in many respects, is perhaps the most overlooked of the bad boys because maybe he was one of the good boys, one of the very few good boys, maybe the only good boy.
Joe Dumars, perhaps the most underrated player in the league.
Defending you, he was harder to shake than Velcro. With the ball, he could score more than 16,000 points or dish more than 4,600 assists. Joe Dumars played his entire 14-year career with Detroit, winning back-to-back titles as a member of the infamous Bad Boys in 1989 and 1990. And then he transitioned smoothly into the front office, producing another Pistons championship in 2004 while president of basketball operations.
Everyone talks about their identity as the bad boys, but the baddest boys is probably their backcourt.
The problem Joe Dumars had is he is cursed by the fact that he wasn't even the best guy in his own backcourt.
Joe Dumars won an NBA Finals MVP. If you ask Michael Jordan who's the best defender, whoever guarded him, it's Joe Dumars.
I covered Michael Jordan for years, and I can tell you nobody gave Michael Jordan fits like Joe Dumars.
Jordan knocked away by Dumars. Great defense by Joe.
Joe Dumars just did everything right. Everything you would want a basketball player to do on the court, off the court, and as an executive, he hasn't done too bad either.
He's less underrated now because of the credit he gets in management with the Pistons.
Joe Dumars has become the ultimate GM in the NBA.
He's one of the most successful basketball people of his generation.
Robinson, the right-hand batter. Long drive to left field. Way back. Kiss it goodbye. Home run.
Frank Robinson definitely falls into the underrated category.
My goodness, what a blast.
Nobody has been through the mill.
Oh, my goodness.
As long and as well as Frank Robinson has.
4.
Frank Robinson's initials might as well have been MVP. He earned that honor in both leagues, 1961 with the Reds, 1966 with the Orioles, and also in an All-Star game and in a World Series. In 1966, he also won the Triple Crown, 49 homers, 122 RBI, and a .316 average.
Triple Crown winner. Nobody does that these days. That's leading the league in average, home runs, RBIs.
Frank Robinson is the most underrated player in the history of Major League Baseball. The only guy ever to win Most Valuable Player awards in both leagues, played hard. For the longest time, he was fourth on the all-time home run list. Nobody knew it.
I think with today's medium, he'd be a megastar. It would be Jordan-esque if a guy was that good and dominated the sport for as long as he did.
Line drive to left field. Well back. It is gone.
He didn't make that all-century team, which was preposterous. They had Pete Rose on there as an outfielder. Ridiculous situation.
That makes me laugh. When I saw those guys picking out the all-century team, and I didn't see Frank Robinson's name in that thing, and I said, what a joke this is.
I know I'm not real popular maybe out there as some of the other guys are among the fans, and it does bother me. I would have loved to have made the all-century team.
Bob Pettit is underrated because that entire generation of NBA players is underrated, largely because the NBA reinvented itself in the 1980s, and almost anything that happened before Magic Johnson and Larry Bird has been shunted aside like the Dark Ages or something.
3.
Long before there was a Karl Malone, there was Bob Pettit. In his worst season, he still averaged a double-double. For his 11-year career with the Milwaukee and St. Louis Hawks, he produced 26 points and 16 boards a game. Pettit had a ferocious hunger for the ball. He remains third behind Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell in career rebounding average. In 1958, he led the Hawks past Russell Celtics for the NBA title.
He was just smooth and had a great baseline shot.
Pettit was the real deal. 6'9", good build, fluid, fabulous power forward who even today would still be an all-star.
Bob Pettit still to this day is my prototypical power forward.
No one with his size at that time could do what Bob Pettit did in the 50s. Incredibly underrated.
He kept the ball high, which was smart because he was tall. He never brought the ball down here. Like big men all want to bring it down low. He kept it up high.
and dominated quite well.
I never walked out on the court that I wasn't ready to play to the best of my ability. And that doesn't mean I played well every night, but I had a desire to excel. I was always striving to be better.
Never seeks too much attention, and is probably okay with the fact that he's underrated.
Two.
If we had the Super Bowl in Otto Graham's day, when we do these lists of who's the greatest quarterback in Super Bowl history, it'd be Otto Graham. That's the list. That's it.
Otto Graham threw perfect spirals. He was, in fact, just about perfect, period. From 1946 through 1955, he threw 174 touchdown passes in leading Cleveland to 105 regular season wins with only 17 losses in the All-America Football Conference and the NFL. Graham had the Browns in the championship game every year, and they won 7 times. To the delight of those with broken noses, he was the first player to wear a face mask.
Because pro football was in its infancy as far as its popularity, and because television wasn't then what it is today, Otto Graham is generally forgotten.
Otto Graham was a player that would fit now because, you watch him back in the pocket, see all the athletic things that he do, and of course he had the great arm.
Otto Graham won the championship almost every single year he played. Otto Graham may be the most underrated quarterback in the history of the National Football League.
We felt we could beat anybody, and we were confident that we could do this. Of course, it didn't always happen, but playing in 10 straight championship games in a row is a pretty good record, though. No other teams ever come close to that.
It's almost like nothing existed prior to the Super Bowls. There was a National Football League before the Super Bowls.
You ask people who's the greatest player of all time, and they will always tell you, well, it's Joe Montana because he won all those Super Bowls. Otto Graham won more championships than Joe Montana.
To me, it goes Otto Graham, Unitas, Montana, and maybe now Brady.
Welcome back to Who's Number One and the 20 most underrated athletes of all time. Here's the first 19.
20.
Tom Watson.
19.
Edgar Martinez.
18.
Juan Marichal.
17.
Evander Holyfield.
16.
Maureen Conley.
15.
Lefty Grove.
14.
Harry Carson.
13.
Don Hudson.
12.
Curtis Martin.
11.
Jack Morris.
10.
Jim Rice.
9.
Larry Holmes.
8.
Andre Dawson.
7.
Hank Aaron.
6.
George Gervin.
5.
Joe Dumars.
4.
Frank Robinson.
3.
Bob Pettit.
2.
Otto Graham.
Look, each of these performers is deserving, but there is one guy who's been singled out on the Let Us Never Forget recognition list. And here he is.
1.
Sullivan's first pitch to Stan is swung on to the drive back into right field. A long one. The ball game is over.
It just drives me crazy the way Musial has disappeared from baseball's consciousness. It's a crime because Musial was an absolutely great baseball player.
Preacher Rose said the way to deal with Stan Musial was to throw 4 balls, then try to pick him off. Before there was demand, there was Stan the Man, with the peekaboo stance and the magic wand bat. The St. Louis Cardinals icon retired with a .331 average, 475 homers, and more than 1,900 RBI, plus 7 batting titles and 3 World Series rings. Only Pete Rose had more hits in the National League. Musial also led the majors in humility.
You've got a bushel of Major League records behind you, Stan. How do you feel about this season as far as you're concerned?
Well, I think I'm right in my prime right now, and I'm looking forward to a fine year.
He is great for this category because he's way underrated. You take power, average, lack of strikeouts, you can make a case and put him easily in the top 10 hitters of all time. The numbers are overwhelming.
Stan Musial is ridiculously underrated, and I have absolutely no idea why. For some reason, when people talk about the greatest players in baseball history, his name does not come up. And that's an outrage because it certainly deserves to be in the discussion.
Line drive, there it is! Into left field! Hit number 3,000! A run is scored! Musial around first! On his way to second with a double! Holy cow, he came through!
St. Louis was at the time the West Coast. I mean, it was a coast, it was on a river, rivers have coasts, but it was as far west as you could get.
Stan Musial was geographically challenged. Had he played his career in New York, we would have called him Lou Gehrig.
He wasn't a great copy, didn't have enemies, didn't have tantrums.
Consequently, the press ignored him more than they did the other superstars of that era.
There she goes again! It might be out of here! It is! Another home run!
He's got a world-famous nickname, Stan the Man Musial, which was given to him by opposing fans. He was given to him by the fans in Brooklyn.
Here's a man with an unorthodox batting stance that put up serious numbers year in and year out.
Even with the numbers, he was unique. 3,630 hits.
The thing I enjoyed most was just putting on the uniform, being a big league ball player, and hitting the 300 a lot of years.
He is one of God's chosen people, and his whole life's been that way. The legend's real. It's true. All of it.
So there they are, ESPN Classic's ranking of the 20 who slipped through the cracks. Did we miss any? By definition of this show, probably. But it's time to check in now with our second guessers to see if we came up short. We join the junkies for sports-loving radio talk show hosts from D.C. and Baltimore for the final word.
All right, fellas, let's talk about this most underrated list. Who's number one? Number one on the list was Stan Musial. What do you think?
Well, it's hard for me to say Stan Musial's the most underrated. He was a 20-time All-Star.
I just don't agree with that.
The Hall of Famer.
I mean, when I'm thinking of the greatest players of all time, I'm certainly throwing Stan Musial in the mix.
It's got to be.
Like you mentioned, 20 All-Star games.
And hello, the fans.
Who goes to 20 All-Star games is underrated.
Right, the fans vote in the All-Stars.
Yeah, but people have forgotten about him. When people ask about the greatest players of all time, particularly when you think about that era, you think Babe Ruth, Joe DiMaggio. You don't necessarily think about Stan Musial.
But Stan Musial has to be on the short list. Every time you talk about great Hall of Fame baseball players, he is brought up.
But also on this list, Robinson and Aaron. I just don't think of Frank Robinson, Hank Aaron, and Stan Musial as underrated ball players.
When you're like a first ballot Hall of Famer, you're not one of the most underrated players.
These are three of the top 10 hitters of all time.
Right, Hank Aaron has the most career home runs, RBI. He's up there in like every major category.
But what I think when people think about Hank Aaron, they think home run king, and that's all they think. He's number 3 all-time in hits with over 3,700 hits.
Well, he played for 28 years.
He led the league in batting average twice.
He was a great player.
Most people think slugger, and maybe they disrespect his total game.
Because that supersedes everything else. Home runs are king.
What do you think about Joe Dumars? Came in at number 5. I think that that's actually a good spot for him on this list.
Yeah, it's probably appropriate. You know, it's interesting, though. He always played in the shadow of Isaiah. But now the way their management careers are going, he's actually overshadowing Isaiah.
Oh, yeah. Plus, there are other flamboyant personalities on that team. Dennis Rodman, Bill Laimbeer, the tough guy. I mean, Dumars played over 1,000 games with the Pistons, 6-time NBA All-Star, and won the 2 rings with
This
Bad
is why
Boys.
I think he was underrated. He was always known as defensive guy. Michael Jordan for years said he was the best lockup man-on-man defensive player. But he was also a great perimeter shooter. Almost 1,000 threes in his career. I believe that leads the Pistons. So he was not just a great defensive player, but offensively he'd kill you.
I'd tell you who I think gets disrespected over the years, and that's Greg Norman. This is a guy who won 88 tournaments around the world. He was number 1 in the world 331 weeks. And yet all everybody talks about are the lost opportunities in the Grand Slam.
Have some monumental collapses.
Nobody cares about the tournaments in Australia and Japan that
they
he won.
still count 88 professional victories.
But it's all about the majors.
5 years as the number 1 golfer in the world.
Okay, it's fine, but he was a choker.
You know, one guy who's on this list is Evander Holyfield, and I'm sure we're probably going to be on both sides of the fence. I actually think he should be higher. I know that he's lost a lot of matches late in his career, but he took out some greats. He had the trilogy with Riddick Bowe, won a couple of those. beat George Foreman, of course, beat Mike Tyson twice.
The problem is, though, he's hung on too long. He's got 8 losses. That really diminishes.
He's limped out, and I think more people will remember him for getting part of his ear bitten off than for all the great things he did in his career. Now, another guy on the list, number 12, Curtis Martin. I mean, when you think of great running backs in the league, you may overlook him, but if you look at what he's done over his career, 10 straight 1,000-plus yard rushing seasons, 90 touchdowns, he should be a lock first ballot Hall of Famer.
Curtis Martin, always steady, never put up the huge fantasy football, gaudy statistics, but every year he's there. All right, well, that's it for our take on the most underrated here on Who's Number One. Pretty solid up top, although we got a lot of beef with the baseball guys on the list.
Well, the second guessers have had their say. Now it's time to see how you, the fan, voted on Sports Nation on ESPN.com for the most underrated athlete of all time. Number 5, George Gerber. Number 4, Frank Robinson. Number 3, Stan Musial. Number 2, Curtis Martin. Number 1, Hank Aaron.
So that's it for this edition of Who's Number One. I'm Trey Wingo, and thanks for joining us for ESPN Classic's ranking of the 20 most underrated athletes of all time. We will be back to continue our countdown of the teams, the athletes, and the events that have shaped our world of sports. Until then, let the debating begin.